The morning of June 4th, 1942. Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Langdon Feebeling stood on the tarmac watching 6 brand-new Grumman TBF Avengers, their engines warming in the pre-dawn darkness. Intelligence had confirmed it. 4 Japanese carriers were steaming toward Midway, the most powerful concentration of naval airpower Japan had ever assembled. Feebeling's 6 Avengers represented America's newest weapon, fresh from the factory, untested in combat. The aircraft looked formidable, massive, compared to the older Devastators. Nearly 5 tons fully loaded, with a wingspan of 54 feet and an internal bomb bay that could swallow a 2,000-pound torpedo whole. Japanese intelligence officers had been tracking reports of this new American bomber for months. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, reviewed the specifications with barely concealed amusement. Another American blunder, he told his pilots. Too heavy, too slow in a turning fight, built by a nation that valued brute force over the elegant precision that defined Japanese naval aviation. The reports claimed the Avenger carried armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, defensive guns in multiple positions, all unnecessary weight that would make it a lumbering target for Japan's nimble Zeros. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What the Japanese couldn't have known, what Feebeling himself didn't fully understand as he climbed into his cockpit that morning, was that within 2 years this supposedly clumsy bomber would become the single most devastating torpedo aircraft in naval history. But first, it would have to survive the bloodiest introduction to combat any American aircraft had ever experienced. At 7 to 10 that morning, Feebeling's 6 Avengers attacked the Japanese carrier force. What followed was slaughter. Zero fighters swarmed the formation like wasps. 20mm cannon shells ripped through aluminum skin. One by one, the Avengers fell. Feebeling's aircraft exploded in mid-air. Ensign Albert Ernest watched his turret gunner slump forward, killed instantly. His radio man took shrapnel through both legs. Ernest's aircraft absorbed 64 machine gun rounds and 9 cannon shells. The elevator cables were severed. The bomb bay doors hung open. The hydraulic system bled out across the Pacific. Only Ernest made it back to Midway, crash landing with one wheel, his aircraft a flying wreck held together by luck and adrenaline. 5 of 6 Avengers destroyed. 0 hits on Japanese carriers. 45 American airmen dead between Feebeling's detachment and the carrier-based devastators that followed. The TBF Avenger's combat debut was an unmitigated disaster. In Tokyo, Japanese naval staff officers read the after-action reports with satisfaction. American torpedo bombers, whether the obsolete Devastator or the new Avenger, were death traps. Slow, vulnerable, easily intercepted. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Japan's carrier-based Zeros could turn inside any American bomber. Their experienced pilots could shoot down attackers before they reached torpedo range. The Americans were building the wrong aircraft, training pilots for the wrong kind of war. But what Japanese analysts failed to grasp, what the carnage at Midway had obscured, was that America wasn't building individual aircraft. It was building a system, and within that system, the Avenger would become something Japan had never encountered before. Not just a bomber, but the centerpiece of an entirely new philosophy of naval warfare. To understand why the Avenger would become so devastating requires understanding what it replaced. The Douglas TBD Devastator had entered service in 1937 as the Navy's first all-metal monoplane torpedo bomber. For its time, it was revolutionary. But aviation technology advanced with brutal speed, and by 1941 the Devastator was a flying coffin. Top speed of just 206 miles per hour, no armor, fuel tanks that exploded when hit, a bomb load that left it struggling to stay airborne. The Avenger represented a complete philosophical shift. Grumman's designers started from a different premise. Not maximum performance at minimum weight, but maximum survivability and capability regardless of weight. The result was an aircraft that shocked observers with its bulk, 13,500 pounds fully loaded, a Wright R2 600 twin cyclone engine producing 1900 horsepower just to lift it off carrier decks. But hidden in that bulk was revolutionary thinking. An internal bomb bay that could carry a Mark 13 torpedo, or 2,000 pounds of bombs, or 4 500-pound bombs, or depth charges, or eventually rockets. An aircraft that could perform multiple roles without modification. Armor plating surrounded the pilot. Not token protection, but proper steel plate that could stop machine gun fire and shell fragments. Self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when punctured. 3 crew positions with defensive armament covering every angle. Most significantly, the Avenger included something Japanese aircraft designers considered unnecessary weight: radios. Sophisticated radio equipment that allowed coordination between aircraft, communication with fleet controllers, and navigation assistance over vast ocean distances. What seemed like inefficient design to Japanese eyes was actually the foundation of a weapon system that would redefine naval warfare. Production reflected American industrial philosophy. Grumman built the initial batch, designated TBF, but by 1942, with demand for the new F-6F Hellcat fighter consuming Grumman's capacity, the Navy turned to General Motors. The automotive giant's Eastern Aircraft Division retooled automobile factories to build Avengers, designated TBM. GM's engineers disassembled a Grumman-built aircraft held together with sheet metal screws, analyzed every component, and redesigned the manufacturing process for mass production. By war's end, nearly 10,000 Avengers would roll off assembly lines. 3/4 of them built by an automobile company that had never manufactured aircraft before the war. This wasn't craftsmanship in the Japanese sense, where each aircraft represented the work of skilled artisans. This was industrial warfare, where standardized components allowed any factory to produce identical aircraft at speeds Japan's cottage industry could never match. The transformation from Midway's disaster to operational effectiveness came through systematic learning. Each combat engagement generated after-action reports. Pilots described what worked, what failed, what they needed. Engineers incorporated improvements into production runs. Tactics evolved based on analyzed combat data rather than pre-war theory. By November 1942, Avengers participated in the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Marine Corps and Navy torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese battleship Hiei, already crippled by surface action the previous night. The Avengers' torpedoes helped finish her, first major warship sunk by the new aircraft. The learning curve had begun. What changed wasn't just the aircraft, it was how they were employed. American doctrine evolved away from the individual torpedo runs that had proven so deadly at Midway. Instead, Avengers attacked in coordinated groups, supported by fighters, guided by radar-equipped controllers, who positioned them for maximum advantage. The aircraft's robust construction meant pilots could focus on attack runs rather than survival. If damaged, they could absorb punishment and return home rather than dying in the attempt. The Pacific War's character was also changing in ways that favored the Avengers' design. Japan's carrier force, devastated at Midway, never recovered its offensive capability. By 1943, American carriers increasingly faced land-based aircraft and surface ships rather than enemy carriers. The Avengers' versatility became crucial, one day striking airfields with bombs, the next day hunting submarines with depth charges, the third day torpedoing warships or supply vessels. Lieutenant Commander Martin, flying from USS Enterprise, pioneered night operations with Avengers. The aircraft's radar could detect ships at 50 nautical miles, far enough for attacking bombers to approach undetected in darkness. By 1944, dedicated night torpedo squadrons flew Avengers, equipped with sophisticated electronics that turned them into all-weather strike platforms. Japan had nothing comparable. The submarine war showcased another dimension of Avenger capability. Operating from escort carriers in both Atlantic and Pacific, TBFs hunted submarines with a combination of radar, sonar buoys, and depth charges. They were credited with destroying 30 submarines throughout the war, including the unique sinking of Japanese cargo submarine I-52 in the Atlantic. The aircraft's long endurance, stable flight characteristics, and large weapons capacity made it ideal for the methodical, patient submarine hunting required. But it was in fleet actions against surface ships where the Avenger would prove most devastating, and nowhere more dramatically than in the sprawling naval battles collectively known as Leyte Gulf. October 20th, 1944, General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore on Leyte Island, fulfilling his promise to return to the Philippines. Behind him, the largest amphibious operation in Pacific War history was unfolding. 650 ships, 200,000 men. And protecting them, providing air support, Task Group 77.4, 16 escort carriers, small mass-produced vessels carrying about 450 aircraft between them. Roughly half were Avengers. For the Japanese High Command, this was the decisive moment. Admiral Soemu Toyoda activated Shogo 1, the last desperate plan to destroy American amphibious forces with surface ships. The mathematics were brutal. Japan no longer had carrier airpower to challenge American fleets. The catastrophic losses at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June had destroyed Japan's remaining trained carrier pilots. The 4 carriers Japan still possessed barely had aircraft or crews, but Japan still had battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever built, 72,000 tons each, 18.1-inch main guns that could hurl 3,300-pound shells over 25 miles. If these monsters could reach the vulnerable transport ships at Leyte Gulf, they could slaughter the invasion force. Toyoda's plan split the Japanese fleet into 4 forces. A northern force built around the nearly empty carriers would lure Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet north, away from Leyte. While Halsey chased the decoy, 3 forces of battleships and cruisers would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions and destroy the transports. It was a kamikaze plan, sacrificing the carriers to give the battleships one chance at a decisive victory. On October 23rd, American submarines detected the Japanese fleet approaching from multiple directions. The complex 4-day battle that followed comprised several separate engagements spread across thousands of square miles of ocean. In the Sibuyan Sea, carrier aircraft from Halsey's Third Fleet attacked Vice Admiral Kurita's center force. Among the attackers were dozens of Avengers. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th revealed what concentrated air power could do to even the mightiest warship. The super battleship Musashi, pride of the Imperial Navy, came under repeated attack, wave after wave of Avengers from multiple carriers. Some carried torpedoes, others dropped bombs. The massive ship's anti-aircraft fire was intense, but the Avengers kept coming. Not individual attacks that could be defeated piecemeal, but coordinated strikes that overwhelmed defensive fire. Musashi absorbed an incredible amount of punishment before she succumbed. 19 torpedo hits, 17 bomb hits. The ocean around her boiled with exploding ordnance. Her massive armor, designed to resist battleship shells, couldn't save her from the cumulative damage of sustained air attack. By evening, the greatest battleship ever built slipped beneath the waves, taking over 1,000 crew with her. Avengers from multiple squadrons shared credit for the kill. Halsey's pilots reported Kurita's center force heavily damaged and apparently withdrawing. He took his powerful, fast battleships and carriers north to chase Ozawa's decoy carrier force. The northern approaches to Leyte Gulf were left guarded only by escort carriers and their destroyer screens. Small ships with light armament, designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support, not fleet action against battleships. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary naval battles in history. October 25th, 1944, 06:37. Ensign William Brooks was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol from the escort carrier Street Low. His Avenger droned through the pre-dawn sky 60 miles east of Samar Island. Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, steamed below him. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanding. Brooks spotted ships on the horizon. He assumed they were American. Admiral Halsey's battleship group, probably. But as he closed for identification, details emerged that turned his blood cold. Pagoda masts, the distinctive superstructure of Japanese battleships. Brooks radioed Taffy 3. The message, delivered in barely controlled panic, would go down in naval history. I can see pagoda masts. I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw. Sprague was incredulous. The Japanese fleet was supposed to be retreating. Halsey's battleships were supposed to be guarding the northern approaches. This had to be a mistake. But within minutes, confirmation came from multiple sources. 4 Japanese battleships, including Yamato, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers. Kurita's center force hadn't retreated at all. It had doubled back through San Bernardino Strait during the night and was now bearing down on Taffy 3 at 30 knots. The disparity was staggering. Yamato alone displaced more tonnage than all of Taffy 3's ships combined. The escort carriers had a top speed of only 18 knots, far slower than the charging Japanese warships. Their heaviest weapons were single 5-inch guns mounted at the stern. Against battleship armor, these were pea-shooters. None of Taffy 3's escorts had guns larger than 5 inches, with shells incapable of penetrating Japanese cruiser or battleship armor. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 0647, massive geysers of water erupted around the White Plains. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns had opened fire from 19 miles away. Each shell weighed more than a small car. Near misses buckled the escort carrier's hull and tripped circuit breakers. The battle off Samar had begun. Sprague made decisions with desperate speed. Course changed to the east, pointing his carriers into the wind so they could launch aircraft. Maximum speed, which meant 18 knots trying to escape 30-knot pursuers. Smoke, every ship making smoke to create a protective screen, and most crucially, launch everything. Within minutes, Avengers were clawing into the sky, but there was a problem, a catastrophic problem. The escort carriers were configured for close air support and anti-submarine warfare. The Avengers weren't armed with torpedoes or armor-piercing bombs. They carried high-explosive bombs meant for shore targets, depth charges for submarines, and rockets for ground support. Against battleship armor, this ordnance was nearly useless, but the pilots didn't hesitate. Lieutenant Commander Robert Fowler from the Kitcoon Bay led his Avengers straight at the Japanese battle line. They dropped their anti-submarine depth charges on cruisers and battleships, weapons never designed for surface combat. The psychological effect was more important than the physical damage. Japanese ships twisted and turned to avoid incoming aircraft, disrupting their formation and slowing their pursuit. Taffy 2, steaming to the southeast, heard the desperate calls for help. Rear Admiral Felix Stump immediately ordered his Avengers rearmed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. While Taffy 3's aircraft harassed the Japanese with whatever they carried, Taffy 2's properly armed strike groups scrambled to reach the battle. Flying at maximum range, they arrived to find chaos. The destroyer escorts were making torpedo runs, tiny ships charging battleships in suicidal attacks that bought precious minutes. The Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts charged directly at Kurita's massive warships, firing their torpedoes and then continuing to fight with their 5-inch guns until Japanese shells literally tore them apart. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, traded shots with heavy cruisers until she was blown in half and sank. And through it all, the Avengers kept coming. Lieutenant Robert Brownston from the Kalinin Bay made repeated runs on the cruiser Tone, strafing her with machine gun fire when his bombs and depth charges were expended. Lieutenant Thomas Lupo from the Fanshawe Bay attacked the Yamato again and again. After expending all ammunition, he continued making dry runs, forcing the massive battleship to maneuver defensively. On his final pass, with nothing left to drop, Lupo threw a Coca-Cola bottle at the battleship's bridge, a gesture of defiance that perfectly captured the desperate improvisation of the battle. The scene was surreal, the mightiest battleship ever built, twisting and turning to avoid attacks from aircraft armed with anti-submarine weapons. Heavy cruisers disrupted by dummy runs from bombers with empty bomb bays, and slowly, inexorably, properly armed strike groups from Taffy II and distant fleet carriers arrived to add their weight to the chaos. The Avenger pilots developed tactics on the fly that morning. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable coordinated attacks from multiple carriers, using radio communication to position aircraft for maximum effect. Rather than individual attacks that Japanese gunners could focus on, the Avengers came in waves, from different directions simultaneously. High-explosive bombs that couldn't penetrate armor could still damage superstructures, knock out radar, and kill exposed crew members. The heavy cruiser Suzuya took a bomb that penetrated her deck and detonated inside. Fires spread through her engineering spaces. Her speed dropped to 20 knots, and she fell behind the Japanese formation. The cruiser Chokai absorbed multiple torpedo hits from Taffy II's Avengers and began listing heavily. The cruiser Chikuma, already damaged by destroyer torpedo attacks, took additional hits from aerial torpedoes and limped out of formation trailing oil. But the most significant impact wasn't the physical damage the Avengers inflicted. It was the psychological effect on Admiral Kurita. From Yamato's bridge, the scene appeared overwhelming. Aircraft swarmed from every direction. Radio intercepts suggested multiple American carrier groups in the area. The ferocity of destroyer attacks convinced Kurita he faced fleet carriers, not escort carriers. The continuous air attacks disrupted his formation and prevented coordinated action. At 0925, just as Kurita's cruisers closed to point-blank range of the escort carriers, he made his fateful decision. General withdrawal. The center force turned north, then west, and retreated through San Bernardino Strait. The most powerful surface force Japan had assembled since Midway was withdrawing from escort carriers and destroyers it could have annihilated given another hour. The Avengers hadn't sunk Kurita's fleet, but they had created enough chaos, inflicted enough cumulative damage, and generated enough uncertainty that Kurita lost his nerve at the moment of potential victory. Combined with the suicidal courage of the destroyer escorts, the continuous air attacks convinced a Japanese admiral that he faced overwhelming opposition when in fact he had been fighting the thinnest defensive screen imaginable. Taffy III's losses were severe. The escort carrier Gambier Bay sank under Japanese gunfire. 3 destroyer escorts went down fighting. Over 1,500 Americans died, but they had saved the Leyte invasion force from disaster, and the Avengers, attacking with whatever weapons they carried, had been instrumental in that salvation. While Taffy III fought for survival off Samar, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was destroying Ozawa's decoy carrier force to the north. The Battle of Cape Engano unfolded as a one-sided slaughter. Japan's 4 remaining carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chiyoda, and Chitose, had so few aircraft and trained pilots that they posed no meaningful threat. They were sacrificial pawns meant only to draw Halsey away from Leyte. Halsey's carriers launched massive strikes beginning at 0800. Over 500 aircraft, including large numbers of Avengers, attacked the Japanese carriers throughout the day. These weren't the desperate improvised attacks of Taffy III. These were carefully coordinated strikes by pilots with proper anti-ship weapons and air superiority. The Avengers from USS Essex, Lexington, Enterprise, and other fleet carriers approached with fighter escort and dive bomber support. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was intense but ultimately futile against such overwhelming numbers. The Zuikaku, last surviving carrier of the Pearl Harbor strike force, absorbed multiple torpedo and bomb hits. She rolled over and sank by late afternoon, taking the ghost of Japanese carrier supremacy with her. The light carriers Zuiho, Chiyoda, and Chitose followed her to the bottom. American cruisers and destroyers finished off Chiyoda and disabled Chitose, which was later sunk by carrier aircraft. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. Ozawa's sacrifice had succeeded in luring Halsey north, but it had also eliminated Japan's last carriers in a display of American airpower so overwhelming that Japanese survivors described it as hopeless. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended on October 26th with American aircraft pursuing fleeing Japanese forces. Task Force 38 planes sank multiple cruisers and destroyers retreating through the Sibuyan Sea. The Avengers, alongside dive bombers and fighters, hunted Japanese ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. When the smoke cleared, the statistics were staggering. Japan lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Over 300,000 tons of shipping destroyed. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific from Pearl Harbor through Midway, ceased to exist as a fighting force. American losses totaled 37,000 tons, including 1 light carrier and 2 escort carriers. These were losses American industry could replace within months, but the true significance went beyond tonnage. The Battle of Leyte Gulf demonstrated the complete transformation of naval warfare. Battleships, once the capital ships that decided fleet actions, had become targets for aircraft they couldn't defend against. The Musashi, designed to resist battleship shells, had been destroyed by aircraft carrying weapons no bigger than a torpedo or a 1,000-pound bomb. The Yamato, which survived Leyte, would meet the same fate 6 months later under similar circumstances. And at the center of this transformation was the Avenger, an aircraft that Japanese intelligence officers had dismissed as too heavy, too slow, too American in its wasteful over-engineering, the same aircraft that had suffered catastrophic losses at Midway. By Leyte Gulf, it had become the primary striking weapon of the American carrier fleet. The reasons for this transformation were systematic rather than miraculous. The Avenger's robust construction meant it could absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Pilots who took hits could limp home for another mission rather than dying in flames. This survivability allowed experience to accumulate. Veterans taught, newcomers. Tactics evolved based on what worked rather than what seemed theoretically optimal. The aircraft's versatility proved crucial as the war evolved. Early battles required torpedo attacks on carriers. By 1944, targets were more often battleships, cruisers, and land installations. The Avenger's internal bomb bay could carry whatever ordnance the mission required: torpedoes for capital ships, bombs for land targets, depth charges for submarines, rockets for ground support, one airframe serving multiple roles without modification. American industrial capacity turned the Avenger from weapon to weapon system. Radar guidance allowed controllers to position strikes for maximum advantage. Radio communication enabled coordination between aircraft from multiple carriers, creating mass attacks that overwhelmed defenses. Sophisticated navigation equipment, including the Uncle Dog homing system using modified B-29s as navigation beacons, allowed Avengers to find targets and return home across vast ocean distances. Japan had nothing comparable. Japanese torpedo bombers like the Nakajima B-6N Tenzan had theoretical capabilities, but they existed in tiny numbers. Training programs had collapsed under attrition. Fuel shortages meant pilots reached combat units with minimal flight time. Radio equipment was crude and unreliable. Navigation over water remained a challenge Japanese pilots often couldn't overcome. Most fundamentally, Japan couldn't replace losses. The roughly 70 B-6Ns at Leyte represented a significant fraction of Japan's remaining torpedo bomber force. When they were destroyed, there weren't hundreds more waiting in warehouses. American escort carriers alone deployed nearly 200 Avengers at Leyte, and fleet carriers added hundreds more. Behind them, General Motors factories were producing new aircraft at rates Japan couldn't conceive of matching. The human stories from Leyte Gulf illustrate the transformation. Ensign William Brooks, whose sighting report started the Battle of Samar, continued flying combat missions for the rest of the war. He survived because his aircraft survived multiple hits. Lieutenant Thomas Lupo, who threw a Coke bottle at the Yamato, returned to combat operations immediately after the battle. The Avengers' ruggedness meant pilots lived to gain experience rather than dying in their first or second missions. Contrast this with Japanese aviators. The few skilled pilots who survived Leyte often died in subsequent actions because Japan had no systematic replacement program. Training had deteriorated to the point where new pilots arrived at combat units barely able to fly, let alone fight. By December 1944, Japan began organizing kamikaze units not because of superior fighting spirit, but because suicide attacks offered better chances of hitting targets than conventional tactics flown by inadequately trained pilots. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. The Avenger achieved a combat record that would have seemed impossible after Midway. Over 9,800 Avengers were produced during the war. They participated in every major Pacific naval battle from Guadalcanal onward. They shared credit for sinking the super battleships Yamato and Musashi. They were credited with destroying 30 submarines. They sank or damaged hundreds of warships, transports, and merchant vessels. At Leyte Gulf specifically, Avengers from both escort and fleet carriers were instrumental in achieving the most decisive naval victory in modern warfare. They helped sink the Musashi. They participated in destroying all 4 Japanese carriers at Cape Engano. They harassed Kurita's center force at the critical moment off Samar. They pursued and destroyed fleeing Japanese ships during the battle's final phases. But beyond the statistics lies a deeper truth about what the Avenger represented. It was the physical manifestation of industrial warfare, not a perfect aircraft in the Japanese sense of optimized performance, not elegant or graceful, but effective in ways that elegant design couldn't match, survivable, versatile, produced in numbers that turned quantity into its own quality. Japanese pilots who encountered Avengers in the war's later phases described them with a mixture of respect and resignation. The aircraft that had seemed laughably overweight in intelligence reports had become symbols of American material supremacy. They appeared in formations of dozens or hundreds, guided by radar, supported by fighters, supplied with unlimited ammunition and fuel. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Iki, a veteran Japanese pilot who survived the war, later wrote about the difference between Japanese and American approaches to aviation. "We built aircraft like swords, beautiful, deadly in skilled hands, but fragile. They built aircraft like hammers, heavy, crude perhaps, but impossible to break no matter how hard they were swung. In the end, the hammer outlasted the sword because America could make 1,000 hammers for every sword we produced." The industrial capacity that supported the Avenger was staggering. General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division employed thousands of workers who had been building automobiles before the war. They produced over 7,500 Avengers using assembly line techniques that would have been impossible in Japan's artisan-based aircraft industry. When one aircraft was lost, another identical replacement was already on a ship crossing the Pacific. This systematic approach extended to every aspect of Avenger operations. Maintenance was standardized, parts were interchangeable, engines could be swapped in hours rather than days. Damaged aircraft were repaired or cannibalized for parts. Nothing was wasted. Everything contributed to keeping maximum numbers of aircraft operational. The logistics network supporting Pacific carriers was equally impressive. Ammunition ships, fuel, tankers, and supply vessels created floating bases that allowed carriers to remain at sea for months. Avengers that landed with battle damage could be repaired aboard ship or transferred to tenders equipped with workshops. Pilots who ditched at sea were rescued by submarines, surface ships, and flying boats positioned specifically for that purpose. Japan had no comparable infrastructure. Supply ships were scarce and vulnerable to submarine attack. Damaged aircraft often couldn't be repaired for lack of parts. Pilots forced to ditch usually drowned because rescue capabilities barely existed. The cumulative effect was that Japanese forces degraded steadily, while American forces grew stronger despite combat losses. The pilot training pipeline illustrated this disparity most clearly. American aviators arrived in the Pacific with over 300 hours of flight time. They had trained in aircraft identical to what they'd fly in combat. They had practiced gunnery, navigation, carrier, landings, and formation flying until these skills were automatic. Many had specialized training in night operations, instrument flying, and advanced tactics. Japanese replacement pilots by late 1944 often had less than 200 hours total flight time. Fuel shortages meant they'd fired minimal practice ammunition. Advanced training was abbreviated or eliminated. They arrived at combat units barely capable of basic flight, let alone the complex maneuvers combat required. Against veteran American pilots flying rugged aircraft with superior support, these novices died quickly. The kamikaze tactics that emerged after Leyte Gulf represented Japan's admission that conventional aerial combat had become impossible. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi's brutal calculation was simple. A Zero attacking conventionally had near-zero chance of success against the American defensive screen. A Zero loaded with explosives and deliberately crashed into a ship had perhaps a 30% chance of hitting. Even then, Avengers proved instrumental in defending the fleet. At Okinawa in 1945, radar-equipped Avengers flew combat air patrol, intercepting kamikaze formations before they reached the fleet. The aircraft's long endurance meant it could loiter for hours, providing persistent coverage that fighters couldn't match. Avengers intercepted nearly 80% of kamikaze sorties at Okinawa, their 650 caliber machine guns shredding desperate pilots who never had a chance. The final accounting of the Avengers' war record is remarkable. From the disaster at Midway to victory at Leyte Gulf and beyond, the aircraft participated in every major Pacific operation. It served in roles its designers never imagined: torpedo bomber, level bomber, night fighter, submarine hunter, radar picket, mine layer. The internal bomb bay and robust airframe allowed modifications that turned one basic design into a dozen specialized variants. The British Royal Navy operated over 1,000 Avengers under Lend-Lease, calling them Tarpons initially, before adopting the American name. They flew from British carriers in both Atlantic and Pacific. British pilots praised the aircraft's ruggedness and reliability, noting it could operate in weather that grounded lighter aircraft. In the Atlantic, British Avengers helped close the gap in submarine warfare, hunting U-boats with radar and depth charges. After the war, heavily modified Avengers remained in service until the 1960s. The basic airframe proved so sound that it could accept upgrades in engines, electronics, and equipment far beyond what 1942 technology had provided. Avengers served as electronic warfare platforms, airborne early warning aircraft, and target tugs long after their torpedo bombing days ended. But it's the transformation from Midway to Leyte that captures imagination. An aircraft that lost 5 of 6 in its combat debut became the weapon that helped destroy the Imperial Japanese Navy. The change wasn't in the aircraft fundamentally. The basic TBF that fought at Midway wasn't dramatically different from the TBM that fought at Leyte. What changed was everything around it. American doctrine evolved to use the Avengers' strengths rather than fight the war Japan wanted. Radar guidance positioned strikes for advantage. Radio coordination created mass attacks. Fighter escorts protected against interception. The aircraft's ruggedness allowed pilots to survive and learn. Industrial production meant losses could be replaced immediately. Logistics kept aircraft supplied and operational. Japan couldn't match any of this. Not the production, not the logistics, not the systematic learning that turned combat experience into tactical improvements. By Leyte Gulf, Japanese aviators weren't fighting aircraft. They were fighting a system they had no hope of defeating. The title that asks whether the Avenger sank 30 carriers at Leyte Gulf is hyperbole, but it points to a deeper truth. The Avenger didn't need to sink 30 carriers. Japan only had 4 left by October 1944, and American forces sank all 4. What the Avenger did was demonstrate that carrier-based airpower, properly employed with industrial support, had made traditional naval warfare obsolete. Battleships that had ruled oceans for centuries became targets. Cruisers and destroyers existed primarily to support carriers or die trying to reach them. The carrier became the capital ship, and the aircraft it launched became the primary weapon. The Avenger, despite its ungainly appearance and disastrous debut, proved to be perfectly suited for this new kind of warfare. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, offered perhaps the most honest assessment after the war. We looked at the Avenger and saw a clumsy bomber that violated all principles of good design. We were right about the design, but we were wrong about what mattered. It wasn't the most graceful torpedo bomber. It was the most effective, and in war, effective beats elegant every time. The story of the Avenger is ultimately about the difference between perfection and effectiveness. Japanese designers created the B6N Tenzan, theoretically superior in some performance metrics, but they couldn't build enough of them, couldn't train enough pilots to fly them, couldn't supply and maintain them in combat, couldn't coordinate them into effective strike packages, and couldn't replace them when lost. American designers created the Avenger, heavier and less refined than Japanese aesthetics preferred. But they built nearly 10,000 of them. They trained pilots by the thousands to fly them. They created logistics networks to supply them. They developed tactics to employ them effectively. They built a system around the aircraft that turned individual machines into components of overwhelming force. At Leyte Gulf, that system destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships gone, 10 cruisers and 9 destroyers lost. Japan's last attempt at a decisive fleet action ended in catastrophic defeat, and throughout the 4-day battle, from the Sibuyan Sea to Cape Engano to the desperate fight off Samar, Avengers were at the center of American victory. The pilots who flew them displayed extraordinary courage. Lieutenant Commander Robert Fowler, leading attacks with anti-submarine weapons against battleships. Lieutenant Thomas Lupo, making dry runs after expending all ammunition. Ensign William Brooks, delivering the sighting report that saved Taffy 3. These men, and hundreds of others, turned a torpedo bomber into a symbol of American determination and industrial might. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Avengers story is a reminder that wars are won not by the most elegant weapons, but by the most effective systems. Japan built beautiful aircraft flown by brave pilots pursuing obsolete tactical doctrine with inadequate support. America built practical aircraft flown by well-trained pilots employing evolved tactics with overwhelming logistical backing. At Leyte Gulf, the outcome of that clash was never in doubt once the battle began. The Avenger hadn't just survived its baptism of fire at Midway. It had become the weapon that helped win the Pacific War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.